Okay, to respect everyone's time, we're going to go ahead and get started on time. We don't have a lot of time for this particular talk. Normally, when I deliver this talk, it's about 45 minutes. So I'm going to compress the talk, compress the talk a little bit. I will share the slides with you. In fact, one of my objectives of this talk, and we'll get into this in a moment, is to have you pick up this topic and actually begin presenting on these sorts of topics. Because the reality of the situation is not a lot of people deliver these talks, right? And you all talk about interesting technologies and APIs and the hottest trend and whatnot, but we neglect a very foundational thing of what actually makes communities work, right? And it is these sorts of things. So one of my hopes is you like this talk enough so that you ask me for the slides and actually deliver this talk yourself. So what is this talk? As you can see, it's fairly self-explanatory. You can understand what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to convince you that you should adopt an open source code of conduct. Who am I? My name is Reza Rahman. In my day job, I'm Principal Program Manager for Java on Azure. Actually, this talk is not so much about my day job because this is not a day job issue. And we'll talk about that in a moment also, why it's not really so much a day job issue. It's actually an issue outside of your day job, and hence I'm delivering this particular talk as a Jakarta ambassador, and I'll talk about the relevance of what Jakarta ambassadors is in a moment as well. Obviously, I would be very happy to talk to you about this topic offline, and that's my contact information. I'm easily reachable, so you can definitely reach me, and I'd be more than delighted to talk to you about this topic. So if you are in this room, I'm going to make an assumption that probably most of you are either open source committers or open source project leads or something of that nature, and probably most likely you have a code of conduct. But even if you do, my other assertion at the moment is actually you still will derive value out of this talk, because even though when I talk to people that have been committing open source for a long time and have been led open source projects a few times, and they have this little code of conduct thing in their GitHub repo somewhere, they actually don't connect the real reasons of why they are doing that, and then what, other than a very high-level philosophical reason, what is sort of the more human reason you need to adopt a code of conduct. And more importantly, even if you have this little code of conduct thing that's a file in your GitHub issue, what does it actually mean? Right? How do you put that into effect? How do you really put that into action? So that is what some of the objectives of this talk actually is. So I do another talk of a very similar nature, but I debate always whether I should include this slide or not. And at the current time, I wind up saying, yes, I need to. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is actually that you, as a consumer of this talk, should genuinely understand why is this person standing in front of you. Why are they delivering this talk? What is their underlying motivation? So I think this slide will help you understand some of that, as to why this is a topic that interests me in the first place. And also, it's part of that equation, or it's part of filling in that equation of taking an abstract context and thinking, oh, this is the right thing to do, everybody does it, I should do it also. Beyond that, actually making a human connection, okay, on this topic, to understand that these topics actually have human consequences. And hopefully, in this particular case, you can see that this person that's standing in front of you is part of that human equation of why these things are important. So this is the reason I put this slide up. I don't spend too much time on it. I think it's relatively self-explanatory what the underlying dynamics are. Believe it or not, some of these things involve well-known people in the Java ecosystem, right? The people, names that you would recognize, right, that are involved in some of these interactions. And I suspect if they were really in this room, they would be a tiny bit ashamed of themselves, right? And obviously that's not my objective, right? It's not to shame anyone or say somebody, hey, maybe you should be doing better next time. It's really about all of us, and how do we do something a little bit better. So is it just me? You can take a look at those sort of snippets of experiences and say, okay, yes, there's something maybe wrong with this individual, right? Maybe he is doing something that causes the frequency and the magnitude of these things to be disproportionate. The truth of the matter is very, very fundamentally different. I'll tell you how I know that. So one, I know that because of data, right? I can take a look at the data and really take a look at a macro level. Does this pattern hold, right? Or is it just me? The other thing I will also tell you is and I haven't been delivering this talk for a while, right? So actually it took me a long time to even get ready to deliver this talk. So I've only been delivering it maybe a dozen times. But invariably, somebody would come to me maybe a day later or an hour later of delivering this talk, and they would tell me, hey, believe it or not, the reason I came to came to listen to your talk is I know exactly what you're talking about. Right, so although people may not stand up on stage and talk about these issues, there's a lot of people that actually deal with these issues day in and day out. Right, so this is a very real problem. But what I can do, instead of sharing those anecdotes, and obviously I'm happy to share my experience, not a lot of other people would, we can take a look at the data. Right, and there's a fair amount of data out there on such things. Right, so there's actually a opensourcesurvey.org that, amongst other things, actually looks at this problem, right? Looks at, is this reality or is it, simply a skewed perception of things? And this is the data, right? So you can see the kind of things that happen: rudeness, name-calling, serious incidents, stereotyping. And the numbers are stark, right? So we are obviously fairly rude folks. Okay, so a good 15% of people have experienced rudeness themselves, and more than half, almost half, have witnessed that kind of behavior. Same thing with name calling. I mean, name calling, imagine that in a work environment, right? If these sorts of numbers came out in a work environment, imagine what kind of work environment that would be. But this is in the context of open source. Again, like, quarter of people have seen somebody else call somebody a name. 5% have actually been subjected to this behavior of being called a name, right? Serious incidents, I mean, can you imagine that? More than 10% of people witnessing serious incidents in an environment, another 5% experiencing it, right? And there's many other such things, right? I think, you can don't get me wrong, Linus is a great guy, obviously. Without his contributions, many of us wouldn't even be here, but guess what? He's the poster child for this kind of behavior, right? There's no doubt about that, and he himself, at some point, acknowledged that he is the source of many of these type of behavior and cause for a toxic environment around him. And of course, there's also things like Geek Feminism Wiki, right? I always find it, I don't know if it's depressing, in some ways it's amusing, right? But if you go on this website, Geek Feminism Wiki, they actually have a listing of all of the incidents that women have reported at things like tech conferences and open source projects. And you look at this and really it's a mix of sadness and almost humor that people can be that stupid, right, in their behavior, and how they go about doing these things, and how unimaginable some of these things would be in a typical work environment. At a even further macro level, if you zoom out, this has some real consequences, right? So if you look at these numbers, this is again the open source survey data. Over 5,500 contributors polled. 95% are women, 3% are 95% men, 3% women, right? In the workforce in general, that's about half and half, at least in the United States. I assume in Europe it's similar. So 50% pool, and we're trickling down when it comes to open source a mere 3%, right? Same thing with even professional computer science people, right? So you can see that ethnic or national minorities are very well represented in general, right, in tech, almost half, right, at least a third. But when it comes down to open source, it drops down to just about 15–16%. Right? These things are telling a story. Right? These are problems that we need to solve in order for all of us to move forward and really make the promise of open source more of a reality. So to summarize all that, let's talk about a moment. Why should we care about all that? Let's acknowledge for a moment that this is in fact an issue, right? Why do we care, right? If you're not a minority, if you're not a gender minority, if you're not a racial minority, if you're not a religious minority, which is basically, as we can see from the data, is the majority of folks in open source, why do you care about this? Right, so let's talk about that. First and foremost is that it is antithetical, that these things that are happening are basically antithetical to openness. If in one hand you're saying, I am adopting open source in order to create an open platform, on another hand, you have this interesting attribute that goes against openness, right? So in order for you to really claim to be open, you need to be more than open by fiat or by rule. I say I'm open because these are the rules I follow. And at the same token, we have these social behaviors that actually counteract that objective of being open. Second thing is, when you are building open source, you are building open source not for a small segment of people, typically. Okay, you're building open source to be very successful. In general open source projects, your objective is to maximize your user base, and typically the user base is global. And straddling all kinds of social lines, right? Whether that's racial, economic, geographic, what have you. And the problem with that is, when you are building such a thing that is supposed to have mass appeal, but the people that are building it actually are not very diverse themselves, what happens is what you're building just doesn't have perspectives at all, right, of your population base. You're not even thinking about the problems. You're not even thinking about what actually is the user behavior or the problem that fundamentally you need to solve, because you don't have representation in terms of lived experiences, right? The reality is we all live in our own bubbles, right? We self-segregate. Our worldview is very focused on, what our experience is in life. So as a result, if this is your work experience, if this is your life experience, and the problem you're trying to solve is this, well, guess what? You're never going to get out of this, right? So you need those diverse perspectives very early on, okay, in your development process, so you can actually solve the right problems. Untapped potential, right? So what's the biggest problem in open source? Can anyone share with me what is it that we go to conferences and scream about constantly and try to repeat constantly? What is it that we ask for? Open source contributors, anyone? Yeah, thank you. Lack of contributors. This is what we complain about, right? We're constantly complaining, oh, please contribute. This is how you contribute to my project. Please contribute to my project because it's so great, and I do X, Y, and Z. Well, guess what? By not solving this fundamental problem, you're creating a barrier to entry. Okay, those people that want to contribute, they're not going to contribute. Even if they did want to contribute, they'll probably look at this, and I'll roll you back to the next slide, previous slide of that data, right? Imagine who wants to work in that kind of environment, right? This is not the kind of work environment we have. Companies wouldn't survive, right, with that kind of data. If they polled their employees and that's the data that came out, who would want to work in this environment, right? Who would want to actually be a contributor? This is even worse, because not only are you facing this rather hostile, toxic environment, you're also doing it, nights and weekends, right? Who's going to do that? Right? Most people that especially are vulnerable to those sorts of problems are just not going to stay, right? Or they're not going to even explore contributing. Similarly, expanding your community, even if somebody is not a contributor, at least if they are part of your community, you need to have a healthy community that has a positive image, right? If you have a negative image of yourself, who wants to be an advocate for that community? Nobody, right? If there's no representation in your community whatsoever, who wants to represent, who wants to be a champion for that, right? So in order to expand your community, you also need to think about these issues fundamentally of diversity and inclusion. Broadening your reach, same story there. And finally, the reason I suspect most of us are probably in this room, and the reason that I probably don't need to explain too much, is an ethical imperative, right? Fundamentally, at a human level, we are, whether you're religious or not, I don't know, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. Whatever your beliefs are, fundamentally, we are actually ethical beings. The reason for that, I'm an atheist myself. I believe the reason for that is because we're social beings, right? So we have evolved to maximize potential of societies, Okay, so if we do not do that, that's why we care about right and wrong. That's why we care about, that's principally why, in my opinion, we are altruistic beings. It's because we care about success as a society. Individual success doesn't matter as much when you're a social being. So just from an ethical imperative standpoint, you need to care about these things, right? So these are the fundamental reasons why you should care. So it's not enough to understand what are, my watch is not working for some reason, and hence I'm completely at a loss of time. Let me make sure I am keeping track of my time. Yes, I am. So I have about 20 more minutes, which is good. It's enough time for me to continue our dialogue here. By the way, one thing I should have mentioned is my objective is, just like I'm trying to recruit you, just like we're all trying to recruit contributors, I'm also trying to recruit you. I do want this to be dialogue-oriented. Right, so if you have a question or a comment, don't wait until the end. We probably won't have time. So just raise your hand and we can discuss it. Okay, so it's one thing to understand, recognize that there is a problem, recognize that why it needs to be solved. It's also actually important to understand why is this such an intractable problem, right? Why does this problem actually exist? Right, these are fundamentally beyond just cutting and pasting a code of conduct document. This is actually the things you really need to understand, right? Because when you really understand this, that's when you are going to be able to apply a code of conduct successfully. First of all, foremost, this mostly does not occur. It occurs in the workplace, no doubt, right? But not in this kind of frequency. So there's something going on, right? Why this occurs in the virtual space, when people are geographically separated, often do not meet in person physically, often if ever, right? This is the kind of situations that fosters these dynamics. So there is a correlation. And I believe it's also causation. It's not simply correlation. So first and foremost, the problem with this virtual space is that it creates a sense of anonymity, remoteness. You're sort of removed from the other person that you're interacting with because you don't deal with them in real life, face to face. Right? It's very, very easy to dehumanize that person and not think about them in the same terms as you would your neighbor or your coworker that you are dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and your relationship with them is not transactional. Right? In other words, it's not a give and take relationship. It's a more complex relationship. Unfortunately, in the virtual space, we strip all of that, right? And we sort of become agents, like an agent of a series of transactional interactions for the most part. And that makes it easier, right, for these code of conduct issues and other diversity issues to be amplified, right? And I can't even imagine how the world of meta is going to look like, frankly speaking. And that is just a disaster in the making of removing yourself to the point where you're just a cartoon. Right? I don't know how much more dehumanized we're ever going to get. There's also a sense that there's no rules, right? I can do whatever it is that I want. It's the virtual space, particularly social media, and the social media debate, right? One big problem with social media is anarchy, right? Nobody is in charge. Everybody can do whatever it is that they want, and ultimately anarchy is nothing much more than law of the jungle, survival of the fittest, which is, by the way, not how human societies operate. Okay, so that is another issue, is like, if there's no rules, you have a sense of impunity, you have a sense of empowerment. Who's going to tell me anything what to do? I'm just going to do whatever it is that I want, and there are no consequences. This is another factor that makes things worse. Surprisingly, online communities have another very interesting attribute, and if you talk to people that study social media, they will tell you this. Social media magnifies social bubbles. Okay, you self-segregate into communities, and you only listen to opinions that you care about, and you only associate yourself with people that have ideological alignment with you and have a very similar worldview. And this is partly what happens in open source communities as well. There's these invisible cliques, right? Invisible groups of people. What that does is that it creates an us versus them mindset. Okay, whoever is not in your group, whoever is not in your clique is an outsider, and that makes it easier for you to dehumanize that person. This is an attribute we all have. Unfortunately, this is another evolutionary attribute. It's helped us survive in the past, right, to easily segregate between allies and enemies, but now it works against us because that's not how we function as a society anymore. But this, again, gets magnified in an open source environment, in a virtual environment. The other real issue is we think it's not a problem, right? We have this sort of self-image that we are all very liberal people and enlightened, intelligent people that are smarter than everybody else, and how could we possibly have this problem, right? But it's not really accurate, right? All of the social problems, we don't suddenly divorce ourselves. We're not as divorced from our social context as we would like to believe, just because we happen to pursue technology as a career, right? So this is very much also false. Right? And the numbers tell a tale, right? Whatever we may wish to believe ourselves, the reality is right in front of you, right? There's people telling you there's a problem. There's data telling you that there's a problem. And of course, there is deliberate and subconscious biases, right? Deliberate, not so much. It's rare. It does occur. It's rare. But subconscious stereotyping, honestly speaking, it's very prevalent and everybody has it. Right, so I'll tell you, I myself I deliver talks on diversity and inclusion. Well, guess what? I have taken something called the negative association test. It's a series of tests by Harvard that says, okay, for this given social attribute, whether you're a woman, or you're an African American, or what have you, does a given individual have a subconscious bias against this group? And guess what? I score as having those subconscious biases on every single one of those that I have taken, okay? So we all have it, right? We just have to admit the fact that we do, right? And again, these are the things that surface, you know, in terms of challenges of code of conduct issues and diversity and inclusion issues more broadly. And finally, the other thing that is difficult to understand, so if you've been paying attention to the diagrams here, that one depicts, like, this is the alternate sense of reality, right, in a virtual space. This one is about tribalism, right? It's your tribe or mine, you know, and my tribe is somehow a lot better than yours, although we're really kind of identical, more or less, right? And then there's the last one is about social inequalities. The reality is, when you are being rude or you are mistreating somebody, guess what? If that person is socially empowered in their society, the psychological impact on them is going to be a lot less. Right? This is just reality. Try saying something rude to your boss. He's not going to care, right? Because he knows he has power over you. Try saying something rude to the janitor, right? He's going to probably, you know, think about that the whole day. Right, that you were rude, somebody was rude to him, because what? He's in the lowest social rung. Okay, he knows he doesn't have power. Right, so it's the same sort of dynamic when you're talking about experiences of minorities and experiences that are simply socially, in any given social context, simply are not in the minority context. Right, so the impact is going to be very different. You know, what happens when a given incident occurs is the net outcome is very, very different. You might think, you know, some people tell me, hey, that person is overreacting. Then I look at that person and I say, okay, this is a woman, or this is a racial minority very clearly, or I know this is an introverted person. This person is not overreacting, you know, in the way you think. It's just that you haven't been in their shoes, right? So you don't understand that the net effect of what just happened is a lot worse for them than they are for you. So finally, how do we solve these problems? Obviously, I've sort of given away the answer, you know, from the very start. The answer is codes of conduct. So we know how to solve these problems as a society, and we have. We've developed these mechanisms of solving social imperfections, actually for a very long time, right? For thousands of years, we know how to not solve these problems, but at least to mitigate them. And that is rules of conduct, right? When we recognize that there is a social problem, what we can do as a society is build rules around it, right? To understand what can we do. That's how we sort of regulate behavior. That's how we minimize undesired behavior and maximize desired behavior, right? A lot of examples of that. Religion is an obvious example of this, right? The 10 Commandments are really nothing much more than Again, atheist, right? So don't get angry at me. Those are social controls. Okay, we're trying to create good outcomes for our society and minimize the bad outcomes. Same thing with every other religion, right? The 5 pillars of Islam, the right way principles in Hinduism. This is all. They all do exactly the same thing. There's rules of conduct. They're telling you what you should do and kind of things you shouldn't do, and we all agree upon it as a society to say we'll do these things. Obviously, there's more secular examples. Hammurabi's laws, which you can argue is the origin of many religions. This is a secular set of laws, probably the most, the first set of code of conduct, first set of rules as human society we've ever come up with. Mesopotamia, obviously, the Hippocratic Oath, things like the Geneva Conventions. These are all the same things. They're simply rules of behaving. They're ways of self-regulating behavior. So we can apply those same things in open source, right? This is ultimately what we are trying to do with these codes of conduct. We're coming up with rules that minimize undesirable behavior and try to maximize desirable behavior. Obviously, we're not going to get perfect at any point in time, but at least it puts us in a certain direction. So what makes a good code of conduct? First and foremost, it has to be clear and simple. If it's way too complicated, nobody's going to follow it. Counterpoint, it also needs to be relatively sufficiently detailed, and it has to have specific concrete examples. So it needs to be simple, but not simplistic. Okay, 2 different things. It can be clear and simple, but not overly simplistic. It does need to have sufficient detail and sufficient meat to it so that you can actually solve the problem and also give people clarity on what is expected and what is not. You want to remove as much ambiguity as you possibly can. You need to have concrete principles. Okay, you need to figure out why is it that we're doing this in the first place, right? What is it that we are after? And how do I seek clarification if it's like really unclear to me, and what I'm seeking is not clear? What is my mechanism for getting clarity? Reporting and enforcement details. If clarity is not enough and it really comes down to it, how are you actually going to report an incident and how are they actually going to be resolved? Okay, so, and it needs to be prominently placed, right? Just having a little file in your GitHub repo somewhere is not enough, right? It does need to be relatively prominently placed. So I don't have a ton of time. I'm running out of time, and I do want to leave a little bit of room for discussion. So normally I would take you to the Jakarta ambassador's site and show you the code of conduct that Jakarta ambassadors have chosen to adopt. We actually have adopted one as is, right? Because believe it or not, this is not none of this is actually black magic, right? So this is actually well understood problem, and the people, surprisingly, that have solved this problem are typically minorities, right? So this is literally the person that originated this is a transgender individual working in open source. And basically, we just adopted what's called the contributor covenant, right? It's very, very, very well written. It corresponds to all of these attributes that we talked about. And it's open source. You can adopt it, of course. It's an open source code of conduct for open source projects. And it has basically all of the things that you look for. You don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Unless your community really is somehow different, right? You can basically take it as is, which is exactly what we did for the ambassadors. Okay, so it's prominently placed. It has, in addition to the code of conduct, it has specific enforcement details of how do you report incidents, how do you get clarity, and so on, right? So again, I would show you sort of quote-unquote live demo showing you the website and so how things operate. I don't have time for that, and probably not the most valuable thing for me to be doing in the 5 minutes that I have. So feel free to take a look at it yourself, right? It's there, and I'll also tell you how to get to this slide deck with the hopes that maybe you deliver it at some point yourself. So lastly, I want to leave you with one more thought, actually 2 more thoughts. There's one more thought in a moment, but I want to leave you with this thought here. Although open source codes of conduct, like the contributor covenant, are very clearly designed for open source projects, it's not only for open source projects, okay? It's also for communities and groups, like the ambassadors. The ambassadors doesn't even have a GitHub account. We're essentially a group of people interested in moving forward Jakarta-E. The Jakarta-E has a whole bunch of GitHub accounts. We don't. right? Same thing for a Java user group. A Java user group can also use its code of conduct. Problems and solutions are applicable there. Same thing for conferences and events. I very much suspect this conference, in fact, I know, because I just looked at the app. This conference has a code of conduct. So conferences, again, are a very good place because, believe it or not, if you look at the Geek Feminism Wiki, just like you have the issues occur often in mailing lists and GitHub issue trackers, it also happens very often in more informal settings and conferences. So very important for conferences to have codes of conduct. And finally, companies. So what do I mean by that? It's not like you need a code of conduct internally in your company, right? Typically, companies have a business code of conduct that actually covers this and far more other things. The problem comes in when the same employees that are well-behaved professional people in their day job, right, when they go and possibly contribute outside of their day job in open source projects, suddenly their behavior changes. Okay, so this is the reason why companies need clarity. Is like if you are going to contribute open source, especially on company time, pay attention to this, even if the project you're contributing to does not. Right? In fact, this is precisely what open source does. Microsoft does, right? Microsoft has a code of conduct that basically explicitly says if you are contributing to open source outside of the company, it doesn't matter if that project has a code of conduct or not. You are subject to this, and of course. We also adopted the contributor covenant, and Eclipse Foundation itself has a code of conduct, and of course that is also the contributor covenant. So it's the most well-adopted code of conduct in the world, actually. And of course there's others like conferences. I have an example in this case of TDC. TDC is actually female-run and female-led. They're one of the first conferences that I know of that adopted a code of conduct, but I could have easily just placed EclipseCon here as well. I very much suspect the EclipseCon website, there's code of conduct prominently placed somewhere. Okay, so again, if there's one thing that you can do to advance diversity and inclusion in your open source project, this is what you need to do. It's almost a baseline requirement at this point, okay? So hopefully, beyond simply adopting it, you now understand why you need to adopt it and how to make it more effective. Lots of examples out there. No need to reinvent the wheel. We reinvented the wheel 10 years ago, maybe. Now it's completely unnecessary. I would definitely say contributor code of conduct, contributor covenant, good enough for 90% use cases, right? If you need to, you can alter it. It's under open source license. You can do so if you want. And of course, it has more applicability than just open source, right? It has a wide range of things you can apply it to. Finally, some resources for you. The contributor covenant, of course, sort of stands on its own. If you want to find out more about general code of conduct principles, some of which I talked about, the open source guide has it, and it has a fairly detailed explanation of why code of conduct and how to do it correctly and incorrectly and so on. And then finally, those initial bits of data that I started with, if you're more curious about that, or in general curious about diversity in open source, some of the problems and challenges, the Wikipedia entry on this is actually very good. It has a number of good resources that talk about these topics. So that is about the time that I have. I believe I have like literally 2 minutes. How do you get to this deck? Just remember the title and Google it, right? It'll take you to my speaker deck account, okay? And that's where the slide is posted. My email address is there. Should you be interested in presenting this talk, hint, hint. You can email me and I'll give you the PowerPoint presentation or any other tips and tricks that I can share with you to deliver this talk. Again, I have about a few minutes for Q&A. I will do some Q&A, and then other than that, have a pleasant rest of the conference, and thank you again for being here. Questions, comments? Yes, sir. Here's the thing. Wherever human beings are, we are a society. Even on a desert island, if there's two people, you are a society, whether you like it or not, right? The question is whether you are a healthy community or not, right? Or a healthy society or not. In order to build a healthy society, and I think you can watch Mad Max or some other such movies, or obviously the classical example, Lord of the Flies. I don't know if you've seen it, read the book or watched the movie. What happens when you break down the social structures and say, everybody is sort of on their own, and it's like rule of the jungle, it's essentially survival of the fittest, you wind up with outcomes that are really, really bad, right? That's the problem. So it's not about, suddenly you have rules and you're not a community. It's really about building a healthy society, building a healthy community. Believe it or not, again, maybe you should try this experiment. Actually, in Stanford, there was an interesting experiment back in the 60s that did just this. They gave a set of people power and a set of people not power. It was very interesting to see what happened. And especially in this country, I think you know what I'm talking about, right? So, so this is the difference. In all social contexts where you have more than one individual, you will need some rules, right, to live with each other in a harmonious way, and to have good positive outcomes for both of you or all of you.
Thank you for your talk. The problem I have, or I see in my environment, is actually it is working very well. So my group, I think, is doing good progress, but it's absolutely not diverse. It is a very homogeneous group, but actually people think that this is a plus. They have less friction. They understand each other. So how do I bring this to such a group?
So two things. First of all, and I talk about this in my other talk, diversity is actually surprisingly tricky, right? You might be looking at a lens and from a certain lens and seeing, oh, I have a homogeneous group. Dig a bit deeper, you'll find differences, right? You'll find socioeconomic differences, potentially neurobehavioral differences, especially in our field. A lot of people with ADHD and different other neurological variations, let's put it that way. Okay, extrovert, introvert, and the like. Right? So believe it or not, even if you don't think you have diversity, you probably do. Second thing, it's not about necessarily solving for current state today, right? It's like building software. You need good infrastructure for scalability, for growth, for managing unpredictability, and so on, right? I hate to say managing risk, but you can think of it that way if you want, right? If you don't have any rules, something happens. Explaining that in a bit, cynical way of thinking, so don't put too much emphasis on that, but it is reality. Something bad happens, the person that's in charge is on the hook, right? You and I are on the hook as project leads. If we say, oh, something bad happened, and guess what? Oh, I could have adopted a code of conduct 6 months ago, I didn't, whose fault is that? But more generically, it's any kind of environmental social context, you're building infrastructure, right? So it's not just because you don't have diversity today doesn't mean you won't have diversity tomorrow, or hire a person that you thought was very good, but guess what? They wound up being a jerk in 6 months, right? That's the kind of infrastructure and checks and balances that you want to build out now, even if you may not have a problem right now. Okay, and anybody else? All right, thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate it. I know it's the end of the day and it's not a technical talk, and hopefully this was worth it for you. So I appreciate it.